Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. And if you are watching us on our YouTube channel, you know you can check us out, take us wherever you go on one of the many fine podcast platforms at which you get your fine or not so fine podcast content. If you're listening to us on one of those podcast platforms, check out what's happening in studio on our YouTube channel. And as many of you know, we have a brand new X account, Twitter account. I still call it Twitter, at Lunch Hour Pod on Twitter. Please follow us there. That way you can keep apprised of everything that's going on. You can see the clips of shows, episodes you may have missed. And as always, you know, word of mouth is very important. Let your friends and family members' friends and friends' family members know how much you're enjoying the Lunch Hour podcast. Very excited. Excited. It exposes my geekery in this area. Very excited to bring our guest on. His name is Arthur Gailes. He's a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on housing markets, housing finance, and mortgages. Before joining AEI, Mr. Gailes was an economist and data scientist at the Othering and Belonging Institute. Previously, he was at the University of California at Berkeley, coordinator of the California Fair Housing Task Force. He also served as an international economist at the U.S. International Trade Commission. He was the manager of the Housing Supply Initiatives and a senior data analyst at the AEI Housing Center before becoming a research fellow. He has co-authored a variety of reports and created data and AI products on increasing housing supply, light touch density housing, and use of federal land for housing, which is something we're really going to talk about a great deal today. He has a master's in applied economics from Johns Hopkins University and a bachelor's in English from George Mason University. Arthur, listen, let me start here, because you are really at the cutting edge of this intersection of data science and public policy and AI. How have advances in AI been helping your work? What do you see as the promise of the use of AI in solving public policy problems?
Yeah, it's really been a sea change. We've gone in pretty much 2 years from nobody in our relatively small office of about 10 people using AI at all to it being pretty much integrated in every part of our analysis. And that happens as these, not so much as the AI models themselves advance, but as companies and businesses kind of expand their tool keeping around the AI models to help it integrate with people's kind of day-to-day workflow. And that's been really exciting to watch.
It has certainly been helpful, I know, in me when I'm doing economic analyses and trying to determine trends and see where things are going, to sort of pull in bits of data here and there, and without having to set up sort of intricate models that are out there, the ability of just sort of to be able to plug this stuff in. Let me just tell you, last night we got I know this is a complete aside here, we got an opportunity for a fundraiser for my nephew's baseball team, having to do with the Ravens season. And I'm looking at this chart and I'm finding it very inscrutable, but I plugged it into the AI and I said, hey, explain to me what they're asking me. What am I? And it did. It really is amazing for the ability to do that, isn't it?
Yeah, I think what the as impressed as I am with a lot of the AI models, when I talk about it, most of what I end up saying is negative because you try to fill in the gaps. Sure. And one of the things that we struggle with is, as fast as AI goes, we end up having to check at each different point that it's kind of followed the chain of logic, right. Especially since we've been working on a paper that we should release in the next week or so, talking about the bias that AI models have, particularly against institutions and ideas that it itself labels as right of center. And that's a real issue when we're working on downstream analysis, because that bias informally tends to kind of creep through at every step downstream if you're not following kind of a center-left technocratic view on public policy. And so we have to be really careful, particularly with like data analysts who aren't maybe kind of thinking on a very high level about the implications of our research, that the kind of downstream biases of AI don't creep into our work.
How did you get interested in all of this? I mean, I obviously, you know, it's a journey. Where'd you grow up? Did you grow up here? Or did you grow up out west?
Richmond, Virginia. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there you go. I mean, I'm down, you know, in Williamsburg. So that's it. But You went to Mason for college, and then what, Hopkins? Is that
Yeah, that's
as I'm
right.
saying this? But so how did you get interested in public policy? How did you go down this road?
Well, in the interim between my bachelor's and master's degree, I started working at a homeowners association
Okay.
and became really familiar with a lot of kind of really local level housing policy issues through that, and decided I wanted to go back and study it. And when we talk about and think about housing kind of as a public policy issue, it really kind of the whole YIMBY movement really kind of exploded as I was graduating from my master's in economics. And so that was kind of a natural field and a really exciting one to go in, because it was kind of a growth field, particularly if you were in California, which is really ground zero for home prices exploding, and thinking about the issues of home ownership for working class families.
Why do people not understand? It's so funny because I'm no longer doing a lot of work in the property rights area. That's where I got my start. I worked for a blind property rights lawyer, 25 years ago. I'm doing a lot of work on healthcare policy now, and trying to talk about healthcare issues in America as a resource economics problem. Housing certainly is a resource economics issue, if there ever was one, obviously frustrated by the regulatory process. Why do people not seem to understand the relationship between putting artificial limitations on housing supply and the commensurate impact on home prices?
Yeah, I don't know that it's not something people understand, except in kind of weird Twitter left-leaning, very progressive spheres. For
Okay.
most people, I think it's less that they don't understand that housing supply has an effect on prices, and more that in their own neighborhoods, people tend to be exceptionally risk averse, which
Yes.
I empathize with that, right? I struggle to convince my own mother that she should allow duplexes in her neighborhood,
Oh
right?
my God.
And that's something I think a
Is
lot
she
of
is she
people,
still
even
living in
into
Richmond?
advocacy, she's just moved down near Williamsburg in New Kent.
Oh,
But yeah, so great parts of the world. But nonetheless, I think people, it's the not in my backyard is kind of an expression of the idea that even if people think that on average these changes are good, they don't want them happening next door, because if there's a 5% chance that my entire life investment in my house is going to go down the toilet, well, I'm not taking that 5% chance, no matter what that equals out to on average. And all you have to do is multiply that out at scale to get to our
sure.
recent home price phenomenon.
Listen, my mother was skeptical. I was working for this crazy conservative property rights attorney, and until she came out and found a bulldozer in their backyard, literally in their backyard. And then we got the frantic phone call. So it's amazing how these things happen. Um, Talk about the issue of NIMBY and the offshoots of NIMBY, the concept of not in my bag. I mean, this is essentially a one-off on the idea of Congress is terrible, but I'm going to continue to reelect my member of Congress.
Sure. No, I think that's right. And so there's a few different strands of thought that kind of go into what we call the NIMBY movement.
Yeah.
Few would actually self-identify that way, but that's
Right.
what the colloquialism is. I think there's three things. First, as I mentioned, just extreme risk aversion in one's own neighborhood. And that, for a lot of people, I think overrides the basic sense of need for individual property rights. I think a lot of people who own homes are willing to forego their ability to build, to tear down their single family house and build a set of townhomes, because they don't have any intention of doing that.
Right.
But meanwhile, they don't necessarily want their next door neighbor doing that, because they don't know exactly, or rather, unless they know exactly what
Right.
the outcomes of that are going to be, and the future is unpredictable. So status quo wins. And furthermore, if you own a property, you have a financial incentive, just like any owner of anything does, in limiting your competition. And so part of the NIMBY movement is just pure self-interest, which I'm not intrinsically opposed to.
Right.
The problem is only when you form something like a pseudo cartel with your neighbors and use the authority of the state to impose the lack of ability to compete in nearby. And particularly when that competition is not something like a high-rise apartment and something like two homes where there was one. So I think that's two parts of it. And then on the other side of the sphere, thinking about people who are kind of more theoretically opposed to development, you get people who are kind of anti-growth generally, and more specifically anti-market and anti-profit. So there's a lot of people who are kind of on the far left and might be called NIMBYs, because they only want property development insofar as it's guaranteed by government to be available either at low prices or price controlled, whatever the thing is. And in practice, a lot of government restriction on the price of housing also restricts supply and pushes that issue up towards the middle of the income bracket.
Well, right. I mean, it's the sort of the twin or mirror problems. They're not really twin problems of gentrification versus combating blight, right? I mean, it's a situation in which, you look at, I did radio in Baltimore for a very long time, and obviously, there are deep and abiding concerns about combating blight. I always have a great deal of skepticism of the power of government to combat blight. At the same time, you got folks who want to see blight combated, but what they don't want is for rents or housing prices to go up, because that's the issue of gentrification. Certainly in Washington, D.C., that's the problem. I mean, how do we go about squaring these seeming incongruous events? Is there a way to square them?
Yeah, I think you're getting at kind of the opposite end of the spectrum from kind of where the YIMBY movement kind of takes hold, which is the San Jose, San Francisco's of the world, where you're buying a shack and it's $800,000.
Yes.
On the other side of the world, you get South Side of Chicago, you get Detroit, you get Akron, you get a lot of cities where they have the opposite problem, where they can't get people to move in. And the homes might even be, as low as $100,000, $150,000 for a relatively well-sized, if older, single-family home, and they can't get people to buy. And there, I understand the concern about gentrification to some degree, but first of all, I do think that concern is a bit overwrought, especially in the short term. It's very easy for a journalist to find a family who had to move somewhere else because their rent went up. But if you look at that from the kind of the big picture data concern, I don't see a lot of interest that modest improvements to people's standards of living is really driving people out in droves. So for an example, you can look at Philadelphia, where they really did have a blight problem in the late 90s. And they were able primarily through, I think, property tax abatements, resolve a lot of that by incentivizing development in and around their downtown areas. And we're not talking about building, big luxury apartments here, because in the 2000s that property didn't justify it, or the value of that property didn't justify it. And instead what happened is a lot of people kind of bubbling up from the ground built one-off townhomes where there were vacant lots, they revitalized homes, et cetera, et cetera. And we don't see any significant decrease in the percentage of minority groups in those areas that got redeveloped. And in fact, specifically because those properties are such low value, the home ownership rates among lower income minority homeowners in those areas tends to be higher than it is naturally. And so what that means is there are a lot of stakeholders who are there who actually own the property, and they're not getting driven out by rising rents. If they move out, they're in many cases actually turning a profit and improving their lives if they leave at all, and they don't have to. And so that affords them options. And then finally, just one more thing I'll say on that is what I'm not sympathetic to is saying, okay, we don't want to drive low-income people out of these neighborhoods, and therefore we should deprive those neighborhoods of any investment moving forward. That's not actually a solution to the problem those people are facing.
Right. No, absolutely. And it undercuts everything. I think the reasons you and I both got into the public policy side of things is that we're supposed to be out there solving problems and figuring out what the root causes of these things. This is actually a perfect segue into talking about California and then talking about the federal lands issue, which is the how you and I got introduced to each other. I was at a meeting and Arthur was giving a presentation, and it was just like it was everything that a lot of us have been talking about in terms of federal lands. Let's talk about California and housing prices and the NIMBY movement. I mean, we talk about Silicon Valley and that area. My experience is a little bit further down on the coast in the Monterey area, watching, people complain about the lack of affordable housing in the Monterey area. There was a point where a huge amount of land was coming on the market when Fort Ord closed, but obviously that didn't have an impact because the preservationists were very concerned about the character of the area. Talk about this. Talk about California's issues, and then let's talk about the federal lands issue.
Yeah, I think California is kind of its own unique beast in the housing.
It makes its own gravy, yes.
Yeah, that's right. And I think a lot of that issue is caused really by people trying to guarantee future outcomes before our housing gets developed. And in particular, in California, those outcomes are related to A, environment, but B, to a much larger concern, making sure new housing gets built so that people can access it affordably.
Yeah.
Usually, and this is particularly true in their housing element process, where they allocate the number of units each city needs to build in order to grow. And they dictate that some percentage of that has to be available for very low and low income people. So what happens is, first of all, they fail entirely to meet those goals. Because they really kind of can't get out of their own way. On the one hand, when they enact whatever price controls or subsidies they want, so few of those homes actually get built as to make they're a drop in the bucket in terms of the overall housing market. And so what happens is you say you can't build unless it's affordable. You don't build, and by affordable, they really mean subsidized. You can't build unless it's subsidized. And then or you don't build enough subsidized units. And then you're left with a very small percentage of the population competing for a lottery for the few units that you do build. And for the rest of the population, prices skyrocket because you didn't allow them to build anywhere in the middle of the market. And then on the other side, you get this kind of unholy collaboration with just kind of local people who don't want, we call it banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near
Absolutely,
anything.
yes.
And so those two things actually work in concert, where on one hand, you get housing production stopped by its requirement for subsidies or inclusionary zoning, which is just price controls. And on the other hand, you get people who say, oh, we don't want anything built here anyways. And that all combines to restrict supply and has created a kind of the blast radius for a nuclear explosion in housing prices that's kind of radiated out to the rest of the country over the past decade.
It really is amazing as you look at, and it leads to sprawl. It leads to all of these other ancillary problems that the left has been supposedly pushing back against. I mean, when you think about it, it's so funny. We were looking at one point about moving to Northern California for a job that my wife was looking at, and we were gonna essentially have to live halfway between Sacramento and San Francisco, depending on the job markets and where we were going to go. And the home prices that far out from these two areas were just so outrageous because you had to get out there in order to find anything that would be even approaching affordable housing. The commute times, people who are living all the way south of Gilroy, California. Not that we need to get into a whole thing about geography. But to commute into San Francisco or to commute into San Jose or getting out in the Central Valley, clogging those roads and the ancillary environmental impacts therein. But again, Arthur, is this one of these areas where when you have a single data point that you're trying to serve, like a single data point goal, whether it's affordable housing or what have you, it skews all of the other public policy results, doesn't it? I mean, we talk about this when you have, say, energy policy that is only directed at abating CO2 emissions. It skews everything else in terms of what's out there. What is that what we're talking about here? That sort of we miss the forest for the trees?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely possible. And I don't want to be entirely negative on California. They've made real progress, particularly over the past 5 years, but particularly in the last year. A lot of what they've passed in the legislature, I think, has a lot of promise to start resolving some of the housing shortages that they have. And furthermore, the fundamentals are strong. I mean, the big problem in California is it's just illegal to build housing. Either literally through single family zoning or less literally, but effectively, because they have permits, they have lot size regulations, et cetera, that just constrains what you could feasibly and profitably build. And just loosening a lot of that, I think, has a lot of potential for a wellspring of new housing to pop up in California. And if you do that for a decade, you could get ahead of a lot of these problems. We've built housing very fast before. That's a solved problem.
Listen, I'm just wondering if they're ever going to start building on the land that is between LAX and the ocean, because that would be, to me, it's prime real estate it's gone purposefully untapped. Let's turn our attention to other metropolitan areas out west. The presentation you gave was very near and dear to my heart, talking about access to public lands and specifically for housing in areas like Nevada, I would assume Arizona, but let's talk about that. How did you come to start getting involved in this and talk about the problem, talk about the solutions?
Yeah, well, President Trump in his 2023 campaign started talking about an idea he called freedom cities, which we've taken a look at. I'll get to in a second. But essentially, that's building cities whole cloth from land that the federal government owns. And people out west will know the federal government owns roughly half of the land that's in the western 10 states. And in some states, much more than that. I think it's above 80% of Nevada.
Oh, yes.
Right? And of that land, what people tend to associate that land with is things like Yellowstone or national parks and
Everybody
forests, et
thinks
cetera.
it's Half Dome and Old Faithful, and it's just not.
That's right. That's right. That's what people associate with that land with. But it's a very small fraction of that land. And two, there's a lot of land that is really doing absolutely nothing. Maybe it's got like a lamb on it somewhere, but other than that, nobody's doing anything with the land. And that tends to be managed by the Bureau of Land Management, which kind of holds the federal government land that back when this was assigned to different departments, nobody else wanted it, so BLM got it. And we took a look after President Trump won the election and thought, well, Freedom Cities is interesting. A city has housing. We're a housing center. We'd like to take a look at that. And what we found is that there's a tremendous amount of this land that's in places that people would like to live, and that's not national parks or conservation land or Native American reservations, what have you. And just taking a look at those small parts of the land, we calculate kind of back of the envelope that you could build 1 million homes in that area over the next 10 years. And if you fully leaned into the Freedom City idea, 3 million homes over the next 40, just on that land at mostly single family densities, which is something we're broadly in favor of, as long as it's on relatively small lots, because that's how you get housing that people can afford to own. And that's on, say, less than 0.1% of federal land. So, but putting it the opposite way, it leaves 99.9% of federal land completely untouched by any development whatsoever. And that just goes to show you the scale of the land that the federal government holds. And most of it you wouldn't want to build on. It's mountains, it's dry, there's not enough water or whatever. But you focus on that 0.1% of the land that's most valuable, and you could build a lot of housing, A, right away, but B, a lot of it's near enough to waters, highways, airports, what have you, and in metro areas. You could build entirely new cities, and we've mapped out, some 400 odd locations, and made a recommendation of building 20 of those cities, which would add, call it 2 million homes over 40 years, because cities take a while to develop.
So let's talk about this. Let's talk about, so I did a study on behalf of my boss 25 years ago about state enabling acts. Not that you don't need to comment on this, just for the edification of the viewers and listeners. So most of these states entered the union with some kind of contractual obligation that the federal government was going to dispose of this land. And then it just didn't happen. As you point out, nobody wanted it. That being said, there still exists this contractual obligation. There would be certain regulations, probably some federal legislation needed, but maybe not, in terms of creating the avenue for this disposal. This is not where I want to go with this. What I want you to talk about is the revenue to the federal government that would ensue on this, because this is something I've, as I said, been talking about for 25 years. Talk about the possible revenue to the federal government by selling just 1/10 of the federal public lands.
Yeah, I think it's a significant potential generator for revenue for the federal government. It's not going to solve the federal deficit or anything, but I think it would bring in, at minimum, if you sold the land that was nearest to cities for immediate home development, at least $100 billion and up to as much as $1 trillion over the next 10 years. And so the way that works is we just take a look at the land that's immediate adjacent to housing that's already been built.
Right.
And you can see this most clearly in Las Vegas, but there's a lot of this land in the Bend, Oregon metro and the Phoenix metro, and in some areas in Iowa outside of Boise. And there's a lot of this land where literally these cities have built housing all the way up to the federal boundary, and then they stop. They stop cold because once the federal government owns the land, it's illegal to do anything with it, including building homes. And so you can see where these cities have just kind of grown out to what is, in effect, a growth boundary, and are now becoming constricted by the prevalence of federal land in those areas. And so what that means is, it doesn't take a lot of land to build a lot of homes, as long as you're not building, 1-acre mansions or something like that. And we could get to getting ahead of that trend later.
Sure.
But when we look at the land that's right next to where housing is already built, where land is already in cities that have incorporated, so it's naturally near water and sewer because people already live there. We estimate that you could build 1 million homes over the next 10 years, just on that land and just with small lot single family housing development. And what that means is, that acreage isn't exceptionally valuable, but if they go for something like $20,000 on what a new parcel is, that allows a lot of room for developers to still build reasonably affordable homes, say for $300,000 to $400,000 new, which is pretty good out west, where you've got rapidly rising home prices. And that's another reason this is necessary, by the way, is because these areas in the West, in part because they're constrained by federal land, have rapidly rising home prices. But getting back to that, each of these parcels doesn't have to go for very much relative to what land sells for in order to add up to quite a lot over the next decade.
Well, and we also need to recognize, and a lot of folks don't, is that when this land is held by the federal government, it produces no economic benefit. I mean, I'm sorry. There's economic benefit, obviously, in recreation and obviously in sort of job creation, any of the sort of land use intensive industries. But in terms of things like tax base, it doesn't do anything for that. And that's why so many of these communities out west, they get their PILT payments in lieu of taxes. Converting this land from government owned to privately owned changes that, right? You haven't run any numbers on the impact of the local tax bases, have you at all? And if you haven't, that's fine. I mean, it's
not directly, but each new home that gets built, again, let's go with the $400,000 estimate for a new home. That's on the low end for a lot of these states. If you build a new home, you get to tax that if you're the jurisdiction. So let's say your property tax rate is 1% a year. Well, that's $4,000 each year for each home. And so 100 homes on this land, that gives you $400,000 back. If you build 1,000 homes, you get $4 million back, and that adds up each year. So this is a tremendous revenue generator, as most housing construction is for the cities involved. And then back to your other point, you were talking about the economic value of this land. Part of the issue here is that the BLM doesn't manage the land; it manages particularly well.
That's very true.
Even leading kind of left-leaning environmental organizations have been writing up the BLM for years for failing to adequately conserve their land. It's overgrazed, it's poorly managed, it's going decrepit, and frankly, the addition of actual human beings who live there, who cared about the land, would be an improvement for the environmental concerns that people might have.
The late, great R.J. Smith at the Competitive Enterprise Institute he ran their Center for Private Conservation, talked a great deal about the issues of the tragedy of the commons and just, how if everybody owns it, then nobody owns it, and it just doesn't work out well. So what is happening? What needs to change? How do we go about accelerating this, getting policymakers more involved?
Yeah, so right now this land is essentially tied up in the bureaucracy. The Bureau of Land Management itself has no particular incentive to get rid of this.
Good point. Yes,
domain. They don't. It's not as if any of their staffers make a bonus from getting rid of it. And so that's about the lowest of their possible policy concerns with this land. And they operate that way. Even developers who want to use it have written to us complaining about 5-year backlogs, so they could build a road that goes through their land, not even buying it, but just being allowed to use it so that you could build housing nearby.
Hold on, Arthur. Full stop for a second, because that's the other way that I got involved in this. We were representing a county out west, the third largest county in the United States, the size of Vermont and New Hampshire combined, 93% federally owned at the time. And you can see the map, the patchwork of BLM land versus other land. And when a public road got washed out, it forced people in that county to go 200 miles out of their way to get from point A to point C. And then a county commissioner got on his bulldozer and bulldozed open the road, and that led to a whole thing. But it becomes very difficult for municipalities to engage in local governance because they have to get permission from the Interior Department 2,000 miles to the east to do anything. This is a problem, isn't it?
Yeah. Not even included in this is the actual drain the BLM puts and federally owned land generally puts on local economies.
Yes.
And so to kind of tying that into your other question about what needs to happen now.
Yeah. Sorry. Of course.
Yeah. Really, if this land is going to be given to the public, who supposedly owns it now. It's got to come down from Congress or the president. And the good news is that the president, I think, can more or less do this with the stroke of a pen. The BLM has the authority to sell land if it determines that that land is better held by private developers in the public interest. And the BLM, furthermore, is a part of the executive branch.
Right.
I don't think Congress is, the outlook for Congress passing a bill to make this happen, I think is I'm fairly pessimistic about it at the moment. They tried during the big, beautiful bill process, and that kind of got thrown out in committee. But that can still come from the executive branch, of which the BLM and the Department of Interior are a part. And I think that this essentially relies on strong guidance from the Trump administration in order to happen. That's going to have to be external to the BLM itself, and it's going to have to be a strong dictate, but they have the authority to do it, and it could happen if it becomes a policy priority. And I'll just wrap that up by saying I think the president needs this as part of his policy agenda. First, because the federal government is aching to do something on housing. And this is one of the few policy proposals that A, will actually work, and B, won't hurt the status of the housing market in general, as most federal policy has tended to do. And B, I think it's as you mentioned earlier, it's a revenue generator. So I think the executive branch has every incentive to try to get this through.
I am, for those of you who are listening and are watching, I'm just sitting here sort of shaking my head in a positive way along with this. I am so thrilled that you are doing this work, that AEI is doing this work. And normally I don't sort of intercede and sort of make that kind of an editorial comment on the show. I mean, obviously folks know my bias, but I am just so pleased that you guys are doing this because it is so vitally important, and it's just great. So let's talk here. As I mentioned to you before the show started, I ask all my guests this. I almost was going to do another podcast called Outside Interests. Got inspired. There's a buddy of mine who does telecom policy, who plays in a blues band, and somebody else who does photography. So I always ask my guests about their outside interests. When you're not doing this work, what are you up to? What are some of your outside interests?
Yeah, probably, fortunately or unfortunately for me, I'm pretty passionate about this. So I spend most of my time in related works. I've been studying the AI models that have come out a lot recently and looking at the ways in which they're constructed. I mentioned earlier, talking and thinking about the bias that they impose on different users' queries, I think is a really interesting kind of field of study that's really just beginning, and that's going to get more and more kind of divergent as these AI models proliferate. And then finally, I'm a family guy. I like traveling as much as I can with my wife and kids, and but that's the gist of it.
Well, that is terrific. Well, listen, how do folks find out more about the good work that you guys are doing, you're doing, and you guys are doing at AEI?
Sure. Our website is at ai.org. We have the Housing Center, our own housing and economic analysis toolkit, which you can find at heat.aihousingcenter.org, which hosts a lot of our most recent work, including what we've discussed today. And you can continue following along with what we publish, both on my own X account. I'm Arthur Gailes. Sometimes I tweet when I feel like it. I also call it Twitter still. And also by subscribing to our mailing list, which is also available at ai.org.
Go and check it out. AEI.org is the website. Our guest has been Arthur Gailes. He's a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Arthur, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been a pleasure.
This has been yet another episode of the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour. Please go and follow us. You got to follow AEI on Twitter, but also follow the Lunch Hour at Lunch Hour Pod. Go and you can check that out. Please, if you're listening to us on one of the many fine podcast platforms that are out there, check out what's happening in studio by visiting our YouTube channel. If you're watching us, you can take us with you on one of those podcast platforms. Hit the subscribe button, leave a like, leave a comment, and let your friends and family members all know how much you're enjoying the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour. I'm your host. I'm Andrew Langer, and enjoy, please, the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.